The history of prison gangs in the United States is rooted in the very structure of the prison system itself. Overcrowding, a lack of proper rehabilitation, and an environment rife with violence created a fertile breeding ground for criminal organizations to thrive. What began as an effort for self-preservation soon turned into something far more insidious. Highly organized gangs that control not only prison yards, but also entire criminal empires stretching beyond the walls. In the early years of the U.S. prison system, the concept of prison gangs didn't exist in the way we understand them today. Early prisons were designed with the idea of punishment, incarcerating criminals to keep them off the streets. However, the realities of prison life, particularly in overcrowded institutions, quickly gave rise to a new set of dynamics. Racial tensions, combined with lack of adequate resources and supervision, led to the formation of informal groups of prisoners seeking protection and unity. The birth of organized prison gangs can be traced back to the 1960s. The Aryan Brotherhood, one of the most notorious prison gangs in the U.S., was formed in 1964 at San Quentin State Prison in California. The Aryan Brotherhood was born out of racial tensions and a desire for white inmates to protect themselves from a growing influence of Black and Latino gangs. What started as a small, racially motivated group quickly grew into a large, powerful criminal organization that operated both inside and outside of prison walls. But the rise of the Aryan Brotherhood was not the isolated incident many believe. It was part of a broader trend. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, prison systems in California, Texas, and other states saw the rise of several large and influential gangs, including the Mexican Mafia, La Nuestra Familia, and the Crips and Bloods. The latter two started as street gangs in Los Angeles, but found their way into the prison system in the 1980s, where their rivalries intensified. The gangs that emerged in the U.S. prison system were not merely about survival. What began as a need for protection evolved into a struggle for control over the prisons themselves. Over time, prison gangs established hierarchical structures where power was concentrated at the top with a handful of influential gang leaders. These leaders exercised control over the daily operations of the prison, including the distribution of contraband, drug trafficking, and even the movement of prisoners between facilities. Prison gangs use violence to enforce their power and keep their territories intact. Whether through stabbings, beatdowns, or extortion, these gangs maintain their dominance through fear. The threat of violence was always looming. And for new inmates, joining a gang was often seen as the only way to survive. The rise of these gangs was both a response to the harsh conditions of prison life and a reflection of the systemic issues that plagued the U.S. penal system. At its core, the formation of prison gangs can be understood as a direct result of the failure of the prison system to address the needs of its inmates. Instead of providing rehabilitation and fostering an environment of growth and self-improvement, prisons became arenas for power struggles. Inmates who were once individuals with the potential for redemption were transformed into pawns in a game of survival, forced to either join gangs for protection or risk being targeted by the larger, more powerful groups. One critical factor in the rise of prison gangs was a lack of meaningful rehabilitation programs within the prison system. Prisons were designed to punish, but not to reform. Without opportunity for education, vocational training, or psychological counseling, inmates were left to their own devices. This created a vacuum in which criminal activity flourished, as inmates formed gangs to gain control of resources and maintain power over their environment. The prison system's failure to provide for its inmates created a space where criminal enterprises could grow unchecked. This was exacerbated by overcrowding, a recurring issue in the U.S. penal system, which stretched resources thin and further increased tensions among prisoners. As more and more inmates were packed into already overstressed facilities, the competition for food, space, and access to basic needs grew, driving many to form alliances with gangs as a means of ensuring their survival. The impact of prison gangs wasn't limited to the individuals involved. These organizations became intertwined with the broader criminal justice system. Gang members operating inside the prison system would often continue their criminal activities outside the walls, extending their networks into the streets. As gang leaders communicated with associates outside via corrupt prison guards or through family members, the reach of prison gangs expanded far beyond the confines of the correctional facilities. The power of prison gangs also spread to politics and law enforcement. Some gang members were able to bribe prison officials to ensure their operation remained uninterrupted. Through bribery, manipulation, and intimidation, gangs gained the ability to orchestrate criminal activities both inside the prison and out. This corrupting influence created a situation where even the authorities could be complicit in the gang activities, making it even harder to root out the problem. By the 1990s, the influence of prison gangs was undeniable. They controlled the prison economy, dictating who could access drugs, weapons, and contraband. They also began to influence the lives of families, often using intimidation and threats to ensure that their activities continued smoothly. For many families of inmates, the presence of prison gangs meant that their loved ones were not just facing life sentences, but also living under the constant threat of gang violence and retaliation. The gang culture inside U.S. prisons has led to a vicious cycle of violence that has proven difficult to break. Gang membership became a way for inmates to protect themselves and gain access to resources, but the longer someone remained inside, the more entrenched they became in the gang's operations. For many inmates, life behind bars was shaped by the decisions they made about which gang to join. These decisions often meant choosing a life of crime, violence, and intimidation, even after their release. Prison gangs are not just groups of criminals confined to the cells behind bars. These organizations have evolved into powerful criminal enterprises, their influence extending well beyond the prison walls. What started as small survival groups in the 1960s and 1970s became sprawling networks with far-reaching effects on the outside world. The gangs did not just control what happened inside the prisons, they seized control of criminal markets and became integral parts of the global criminal economy. As these gangs grew in power and sophistication, they established intricate systems of communication and operations that allowed them to run illegal activities inside and outside the prison system. From drug trafficking to money laundering and even human trafficking, prison gangs began to create vast criminal empires. The gang leaders, often serving life sentences in solitary confinement, continued to command their organizations from behind bars, using surrogates, visitors, and even corrupt prison staff to execute their orders. One of the most striking elements of these prison gangs is their ability to maintain discipline and order within the prison. With thousands of inmates housed in overcrowded, underfunded facilities, the prison system quickly lost control over the everyday life of its inhabitants. Gangs filled this power vacuum, creating an alternative order based on fear, loyalty, and violence. The Aryan Brotherhood, Crips, Bloods, Mexican Mafia, and other gangs all employed a rigid hierarchy with a clear chain of command. At the top were the gang leaders, the masterminds who pulled the strings. Below them were the lieutenants, the soldiers, and at the bottom, the foot soldiers who carried out orders. To keep control, gang members were expected to adhere to a code of conduct. Disrespect or disobedience was met with brutal consequences. A fight over territory could easily escalate into a violent massacre, with inmates attacking each other with makeshift weapons, usually resulting in life-threatening injuries. A simple debt could lead to extortion, where gang members would demand protection money from weaker inmates. Those who didn't comply were often punished severely, sometimes resulting in murder. But the true scope of these gangs' power went far beyond what happened behind prison walls. As the 1980s and 1990s saw an increase in mass incarceration, the rise of these prison gangs paralleled the increasing rates of gang-related violence in American cities. Gangs like the Bloods and Crips, which had originated as street gangs, established footholds within the prison system. What was once a battle for control of Los Angeles neighborhoods soon became a battle for dominance inside the prisons, and the rivalry between the Bloods and Crips intensified. This battle wasn't just about turf. It was about resources. The gangs controlled the drug trade inside prisons, establishing smuggling routes and dealing drugs, including heroin, marijuana, and even cocaine, through a network of trusted inmates. Many of these drugs were brought into the system by prison staff, some of whom were bribed or coerced into cooperating with the gangs. This situation created a thriving illicit market where gang members not only sold drugs to inmates, but also used their power to profit from smuggling these substances out to the streets. The problem, however, wasn't confined to just the gang's internal operations. As gang members left prison and re-entered society, their criminal networks followed them. Former inmates who had once been a part of the Mexican Mafia, for example, continued their criminal operations from the streets. They used their time behind bars to build contacts, create alliances, and establish networks that extended beyond the prison yard. For these individuals, incarceration wasn't a sentence, it was an opportunity to expand their criminal reach. Even those who weren't directly involved in gangs were affected. Families and communities on the outside became entangled in the web of gang operations. Many gang members use their families as intermediaries to transport messages, money, and drugs in and out of the prison system. Illegal activities like racketeering and extortion weren't just limited to fellow inmates. Inmates would demand money or services from their families or businesses in exchange for protection, using their influence from inside the system to manipulate the outside world. Gang-controlled prisons became microcosms of a larger criminal society, where violence, extortion, and drug trafficking were the norm. The Mexican Mafia, for example, would charge Latino inmates exorbitant amounts for protection, while the Aryan Brotherhood and other white supremacist groups ran their own extortion rackets within their racial divisions. Even guards and prison officials, who were supposed to uphold the law, were often drawn into the gang's web, either through threats or corruption. The reality was that these gangs controlled nearly every aspect of life within the prisons. Inmate hierarchy was determined not just by physical strength, but by loyalty to the gang. And many inmates were drawn into gang activity because it was the only way to survive. Gangs became integral parts of the social structure, and leaving one's gang could often result in violence or death. The loyalty to these groups was not just about belonging, it was about staying alive. While these gangs built their empires behind bars, they also planted the seeds for crime that would continue to bloom long after their release. For years, these gangs have been able to operate within and outside the prison system, relying on their ability to infiltrate the criminal justice system. They continue to operate unimpeded, using their resources to influence policy, intimidate officials, and push their criminal interests to be prioritized. So how does the system fight back against this level of control? The reality is that reforming the prison system isn't just about improving conditions inside the walls. It requires addressing the root causes that give rise to these gangs in the first place: overcrowding, lack of rehabilitation, insufficient resources, and the fact that these organizations can operate with near impunity. Without serious reform, the cycle of violence, control, and crime within U.S. prisons will continue, and these gangs will remain a force to be reckoned with both inside the walls and beyond. The story of prison gangs is not just one of violence and control, it's also a story of the systemic failures that allow these gangs to thrive. For years, the U.S. prison system has been plagued by overcrowding, poor conditions, and lack of meaningful rehabilitation. These issues have created the perfect environment for criminal organizations to establish their dominance, not just inside the prison walls, but across the entire country. Prison gangs don't operate in isolation. They have established deep criminal networks that stretch from the prison yards to the streets, and even into other aspects of society. The fact that these gangs have managed to infiltrate the prison system and expand their operations outside shows just how ineffective the prison system has been in its attempts to address gang activity. Every step of the prison gang's rise to power can be traced back to systemic flaws that have allowed them to thrive unchecked. Without reform, the situation will only get worse. But addressing the root causes of gang control within prisons requires more than just better management of facilities. It requires addressing the underlying issues that perpetuate these gangs' existence: the lack of rehabilitation programs, mental health care, job training, and educational opportunities for inmates. When prisons fail to provide these opportunities, they essentially become breeding grounds for criminality. Inmates have little to lose and often join gangs for survival or a sense of belonging. They create alliances with other inmates, and in many cases, violent action becomes the only way to gain power, respect, or protection. The overcrowding of U.S. prisons is one of the most significant contributors to the rise of these gangs. When prisons become too crowded, the resources available to inmates, including educational programs and counseling, become limited. Inmates who are not properly addressed by rehabilitation efforts often turn to gangs to make sense of the chaos around them. They provide a sense of purpose, a structure for those who are otherwise left to fend for themselves. In the absence of functional systems designed to aid inmates in rehabilitation, gangs step in to fill the void. Reforming the prison system and reducing the power of gangs is no simple task. It's not just about increasing prison sentences or improving physical conditions. It's about creating a path to reform that offers real opportunities for those incarcerated. The approach should focus on restorative justice, aiming to rehabilitate inmates instead of simply punishing them. This means providing access to education, vocational training, and mental health services, all of which are critical in breaking the cycle of crime that has come to define much of the U.S. prison system. Despite these efforts, there is still significant resistance to prison reform. Gangs have entrenched themselves deeply into the fabric of the system, and as a result, any attempt to dismantle their power faces major obstacles. Prison guards are often caught in the crossfire, either unwillingly participating in the gang's operations or being threatened into compliance. Meanwhile, inmates who attempt to break free from gang affiliations are often subjected to violent retaliation. The violence becomes self-perpetuating. It is a vicious cycle that doesn't just affect those behind bars, it has far-reaching consequences for the families, communities, and law enforcement officers involved. In a world where these gangs control so much of the system, it's hard to imagine a way out. Even the most well-intentioned reformers face fierce opposition, not just from the gangs, but from entrenched political and economic systems that benefit from maintaining the status quo. For example, private prison corporations have a vested interest in keeping incarceration rates high, as it ensures they continue to profit from housing inmates. These corporations often lobby for tougher sentencing laws, increasing the number of prisoners and keeping them incarcerated longer. This results in more overcrowded prisons and a greater opportunity for gangs to take root and thrive. The criminal justice system itself is not free from blame. The over-reliance on punishment over rehabilitation has been a significant factor in the growth of prison gangs. Until society addresses the root causes of crime, poverty, lack of education, mental illness, and systemic inequality, gangs will continue to flourish in prisons, using fear, power, and control as their tools. So, what's the solution? How can we dismantle these gangs' power, both inside the prison walls and beyond? The path to reform is long, complicated, and fraught with challenges, but it is possible if the system is willing to change. For change to happen, we need to address the very structure of our penal system, shifting from a focus on punishment to a focus on rehabilitation and restorative justice. Only by providing inmates with the tools they need to reintegrate into society can we hope to break the power of these gangs and begin dismantling the cycle of violence that continues to define U.S. prisons. However, reforming the system means confronting the deeply embedded corruption and powerful interests that benefit from keeping the system as it is. This will require a massive cultural shift within both law enforcement and society at large. And while many are pushing for change, the path forward is not clear. There is still a long road ahead, and the biggest question remains: are we ready to dismantle the empire of blood and power that these prison gangs have built, or will they continue to thrive in the shadows of the system?